Hello everyone. So I have started the series data like company wise interview preparation. So I will be start for Databricks. There is a three round. First is manager round. Second is technical round. Third is also technical round. Fourth is okay, uh, HR round and your hiring manager round and manager round. So I will be start one by one round. Round. So basically introduction. अब ना interview question. So first in hiring manager, introduction and project introduction. So he will ask you according to your project, what kind of things. So if you include Spark, definitely if you are working on, if you are applying Databricks, definitely you have one of the key skills Spark. So first of all, question Spark architecture. So question number one, they will definitely ask you what is the Spark architecture, right? How to solve this architecture question? So basically, you can say Apache Spark framework use master-slave architecture. Apache Spark framework use master-slave architecture that consists a driver which run as a master node and many executor that run across the worker nodes in the cluster. Apache Spark can be used for the batch processing and real-time processing as well. So if they ask what is the Spark architecture, so you just explain what is the Spark architecture. We don't need to go in deeper part. First we explain what is the Spark architecture. So Apache Spark framework, what we can say, Apache Spark framework use master slave architecture that consists a master node, consists a driver which is run as a master node and many executor that run across as a worker node in the cluster. Is it clear? Apache Spark can be used for the batch processing and so definitely whenever they ask you what is the Spark architecture, you can just simply say Apache Spark. So definitely if in Databricks interview, they will definitely ask you what is the Spark architecture. So basically you can say Apache Spark framework you Apache Spark framework use master slave architecture that consists a driver driver which run as a master node and many executor that run a, run as a worker nodes in the cluster. Many executors that run across as a worker node in the cluster. Apache Spark can be used for the batch processing and real-time processing of this architecture. So there is it has consist driver node, driver program, worker node, and cluster manager. Just say this advantage. We don't need to go more detail. If we are asking the working functionality, then we go for the detail. So I'm repeating one more time. What is the Spark architecture? So you can say Apache Spark framework used as a master slave architecture that consists a driver node which run as a master node and many executor that run across as a worker node in the cluster workers in the cluster. So Apache Spark can be used for the batch processing and real-time processing. So we take care of this part. I think this is a simpler one. This is architecture. So it consists driver program, cluster manager, worker. Now, question number two. They will ask you, what is the Spark driver? Right? What is the Spark driver? The driver is a program or is a process for responsible for coordinate the execution of Spark application. It run the main function and create the Spark context or a Spark session which connect to the cluster manager. Just see this diagram. I am writing again in this block. So definitely the next question interview will ask you, what is the Spark driver? So they will say the Spark driver. The driver is the program or process. The driver is the program or process for responsible for coordinate the execution of a Spark application. So you can say the driver is the program for responsible the execution of a Spark application. So I think the driver is the program or process responsible for. I think this is the perfect line. You can say, don't be, you don't need to MTR. You don't need to uh, rememberize this one. This is the process how to speak while you are asking to any of the interviewer. Slowly. Slow is the best policy when you explain anything, right? Don't be afraid. If you're slow and clear, then it will be help you to understand the mindset of yours. So I can say the driver is a program or process which is responsible the execution of the Spark application. Basically, we are running the Spark application because of driver node, right? So driver is the program or process for responsible for coordinating the execution of a Spark application. All right. So whenever he asking what is the Spark driver or driver node, so basically is the program or process which is responsible for coordinate the execution of a Spark application. It run the driver run the main function and create the Spark context which connect the cluster manager. So because of a Spark context, you are able to create a cluster manager. So till now we have discussed Spark driver. So maybe in the interview, database interview, because we are preparing for the database interview, or in what I have seen, what as per my experience, in the hiring manager will ask you, what is the Spark architecture? Simply, and they will ask you, what is the Spark architecture? Please tell me about the Spark architecture, right? So you need to prepare it. So you can say the driver. So you can say the driver is the program or process for responsible for coordinating the execution of a Spark application. It run the main function and create the Spark context, which connect the cluster manager. So basically, you don't need to go in more detail also. You can say the driver node, the Spark driver is responsible to execution the Spark application. It run the Spark context and main function. It run the main function and create the Spark context and Spark session, which connect the cluster manager, basically. What is the Spark session? Spark executor. So Spark executor is are the worker process. The executor are the worker process responsible for executing the task in the Spark application. Executor are the responsible for the executing the task for the Spark application. They launch, they executor are launched on the worker node and communicate with the driver program and cluster manager. Execute the run task concurrently. Store the data in memory or disk for caching and intermediate storage. The Spark driver is the responsible this Spark run this Spark application, the execution of a Spark application, and it run the main program and create the Spark context or Spark session, which connect to the cluster manager. And we can say Spark session is the entry point of this Spark application. All right. Now talk about the Spark executor. So executor is also one of the important concept. Executor are work. Executor is responsible for the executing task in the Spark application. They are launched top on the worker node and communicate with the other driver program, with the driver program cluster manager. Executor run the task concurrently, store the data in memory or disk for the caching or intermediate storage. Simple. Be simple. We discussed three things till now. Driver pro architecture. Then we think about the Spark executor and Spark. Uh, so I'm just repeating again these three concepts slowly. Correct. So again, I'm going with the Spark architecture. So this is a Databricks. We are preparing for the Databricks interview, right? Or they will definitely ask you what is the Spark architecture in the first question. Okay, so Apache Spark framework use the master-slave architecture that consists driver node which run as a master node and many executor that run across the worker node in the cluster. This Apache Spark can be used for the batch processing and real-time processing as well. You can explain. So many executors that run across as a worker node in the cluster. Apache Spark can be used for the batch processing and real-time processing. There is a cluster manager as well. Okay. So you discuss what is the Apache Spark? Spark driver. Definitely, the next question they will ask you, what is the Spark driver? You say, driver is the program. The driver is the master node. Is a program is the responsible for the execution of Spark application. Driver is the program for the responsible for the execution of Spark application that run the main function and create the Spark context and Spark session which connect to the cluster manager. Basically, you can say this. Executors are responsible for running the task, executing the task in this Spark application. They launch on the worker node and communicate with the driver node. Executor run the task concurrently and store the data in memory or disk or for caching and intermediate storage. You can say. What is the cluster manager? They will ask you definitely this question. What is cluster manager? Cluster manager is the responsible for allocating. So बस you try to make a not you have to rectification. I would say to try to more calm and cool and give the answer in a proper way or just justified way. So cluster manager is responsible for allocating the resource and managing the cluster on which the Spark application run. So Spark support various cluster manager, Apache Mesos, Hadoop, yeah, standalone cluster manager, right? Right? Cluster manager. So cluster manager allocating is responsible. Cluster manager is responsible for allocating the tasks, sorry, allocating the resources and managing the cluster which Spark application run. Spark has a four cluster. Spark support various cluster like Yarn, Mesos, Hadoop, and standalone cluster. These are the four cluster. What is the question number 5? I think this is one of the important. What is the Spark context in a Spark session? So Spark context in a Spark session. Spark context is an entry point for any Spark functionality. Spark context and Spark session is the entry point of any Spark functionality. Represent the connection of Spark cluster. It represent the connection of the Spark cluster. So we can use the Spark create RDD, accumulator, broadcast variable, spark context, coordinate the execution of the task. Also, I would say coordinate of the execution of the task, right? There is another thing, a Spark session. Spark session contain all the entry point. We have a Hive context, SQL context, and we have a streaming context. So we will define the different context previously. Now after the Spark 1.6 and 2.1, we have a Spark session where we can use all the context in a one entry point. They will definitely ask you, what is the task? So what is the task? Task is the smallest unit of the spark of work in a spark. Task is the smallest unit of computation in the spark. Represent a unit of computation that can perform single partition of data. Task is the represent the unit of computation that can be performed on the single partition. The driver program divided the job, spark job into the tasks, assign them to the executor node for execution. Simple. That is a. I think this is a very simple question. I think, right? So many company are. What are the execution modes are available? in Spark. So cluster mode. So cluster mode is probably most common way to running the Spark application. In cluster mode, users submit the pre-compiled Java, Python, and RC to the cluster manager. Cluster manager launch a driver process. So this is the what are the executing mode in Spark? I think this is a very common question there. I think every company is asking. So we have a so basically we have a cluster mode. Cluster mode is probably the most common way to running the Spark application. So cluster mode users submit the precompiled jar Python as to the cluster manager. Cluster manager launches the driver process and cluster manager and on a worker node inside the cluster. And this means cluster manager is responsible for the Spark application related process. We have a client mode also, local mode. And client mode is nearly same as the cluster mode, except Spark driver remain on the client machine and submitted the application. This means client machine is responsible for maintaining the Spark driver process. And there is the cluster manager and the cluster manager maintaining the executor process. But in this uh, previous process, cluster mode probably more Spark application. In cluster mode, users submit to the precompiled Java Python script or the script. So basically, they will ask you what are the executed mode in the Spark execution mode. These are the cluster manager types. So execution mode, deployment mode, we can say. Cluster node and client structure. So basically, these are cluster mode probably most common way to running the Spark application. In cluster mode, you users submit the predefined pre-compiled jar, Python, and R script to the cluster manager. And cluster manager launches the driver process on a worker node inside the cluster. And in addition to the executor process. This means cluster manager responsible maintaining all the Spark application. Client mode is nearly same is the Spark process, but it client mode is maintaining the Sparks. Client machine is maintaining the Spark driver process, and cluster manager maintaining the executor process. So if you understand that simply, cluster manager responsible for to maintaining the driver process and executor process. However, client node only maintaining the driver process, cluster manager maintaining the executor process. So this is the question I would say. Let me move to the another more question to you.